Have you ever taken such a leap?
Why did you leave?
They're still walking.
Can you explain to me why? I'm asking.
Explain this.
The Fifth Estate.
We have been involved in or turned our blind eye on all sorts of nasty and dirty things, all over the world.
Tonight on the Fifth Estate, Seeds of Terror, the legacy of the Afghanistan War's deadly alliance, fundamentalist faith and American firepower.
It was a recruiting ground for all kinds of lunatics.
Have the freedom fighters of the 80s become the terrorists of the 90s?
This man is the godfather of international terrorism.
I'm a symbol of a new movement that will change the history of humanity.
Lyndon McIntyre uncovers new allegation in the Air India case.
The United States stonewalled Canada and then enlisted Canada's help in stonewalling the world.
Good evening. Welcome to the Fifth Estate. I'm Lyndon McIntyre. Tonight, a special full edition investigation. International terrorism. We've seen it at work in the Air India bombing, in the World Trade Center attack, and in two very recent events in Canada. They all have a crucial connection. Our story tonight will trace them back to their roots in superpower maneuvering. It's the story of how the United States' determination to make Afghanistan the pivotal battle of the Cold War and the unlikely alliances it forged dragged the Americans into a quagmire and in the process helped sow the seeds of terror. Among other things, it may well have led to the concealment of crucial evidence in the hunt for the Air India bombers. Ottawa Airport, May 25th, 1992. Two men are rushing to catch an early evening flight to Toronto. They're anonymous to most people around them as they hurry towards an escalator to the departure lounge. But before they reach it, they are recognized by a single bystander who moves to intercept them. There is a brief, violent confrontation. When it ends, one of the travelers lies near death from a head injury. He will recover, but the shock waves will cause outrage far from Ottawa. Khartoum. The incident was an offshoot from a bitter struggle that is fueling revolution from Sudan to Afghanistan and fears of violence closer to home. The man injured in Ottawa and the star at this rally is the spiritual power behind the military regime in Sudan, the most influential voice in the world of Islam since the death of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. He is Dr. Hassan al-Turabi, Western educated and urbane, but no less hostile than Khomeini to Western influences in the Islamic world. He urges his followers to oppose enemies of Islam in the West with all their strength and to drive fear into their hearts.
This man is the godfather of international terrorism.
This is the man who almost killed Turabi in Canada. Mohammed Hashim, 6 feet 8 inches tall, a former world karate champion from Sudan, now a martial arts instructor in Ottawa. But still a formidable enemy of people he believes brought terrorism to his homeland and his Muslim religion.
They have the right to go and kill people. Anybody can kill. They have just, they have the blessing of God when they do that.
You've been called the godfather of terrorism. Why is that?
Well, probably people who don't know me. I know why they call me that way. Because I'm a symbol of a new movement that will change the history of humanity.
Islam unifies hundreds of millions of poor people in the third world. It has become a call for change, and the voice has taken on a threatening tone. Last year, the United States listed Sudan as a sponsor of terrorism. But Islamic fundamentalist leaders like Dr. Tarabi insist the rise of Islam is only a spiritual revival.
I don't think that the Islamic movements generally are based on violence because they are religious. Religion addresses a conscience of sincerity and complete loyalty to God. I mean, not coerced by the force of or power at all.
For them, revival is conquest. It's power.
They're not holy men. You're saying they're
No. For them, like these people are just using Islam in order to subdue others.
Would you clearly condemn violence as an instrument of change?
Well, the initiation of violence, I would condemn it definitely because this is aggression. But the response to violence by counter-violence as a means of resistance and of self-defense and ultimately of revolution, you may have to use force also to counter him. And the word jihad, it means exactly, literally means in language, not war, not holy war. It only means struggle.
Is there a jihad in progress now?
People feel that the West today is not playing a fair, just humanitarian role, unfortunately. And that's why probably you have to struggle against the West now.
America must be destroyed. Sudan must be built strong. The songs and rhetoric never stray far from a dominant theme: Islam under siege.
They say that a superpower is against Islam. I say, when was in our history superpower not against Islam?
This event was organized and attended by the world's most militant Islamic leaders. They are here from the ongoing war in Bosnia, from the war they won in Iran, from the struggle in Palestine.
And Islam has emerged as a force.
The tone has not affected the choice of beverage, but the beverage fails to sweeten feelings about the West. The mood will not improve when a bulletin arrives from Ottawa. An announcement that the man who almost killed Tarabi has just been acquitted by a Canadian jury. He promises retaliation against the new villain, Canada. They believe Hashim, the karate expert, was a hired assassin. Tarabi says nobody is fooled by the fact his attacker was Sudanese.
I know in America it's good to put up a Sudanese or someone who is black to call just a couple of niggers fighting in the airport and dismiss it.
He is convinced the incident was initiated by security services in the United States and Canada.
I don't know the security service in Canada, how it's organized, but there is definitely somebody who had something to do with it, whether he knew about it and he opened his system for that conspiracy against me. I'm sorry that this has touched the Canadian image worldwide among the Muslims. All over the world, the Muslims have reacted to what happened to me in Canada. It's up to Canadians to think if they don't care, I mean, how they look like among the Muslims generally worldwide.
The incident at the Ottawa airport may have seemed to the handful of Canadians who heard about it just another fracas among foreigners, but it has drawn Canada into an ever-widening orbit of violence many people attribute to the murky politics of Islamic fundamentalism, a movement which got its current momentum in a war the West quietly applauded and paid for. Islam's holiest, bloodiest, and ultimately most successful war this century, Afghanistan. For a decade, it was also America's war. A partnership between the holy warriors of Islam and the cold warriors of Washington. A marriage of convenience held together with help from a pro-American Islamic fundamentalist government in Pakistan. trucks from Pakistan were part of a massive shuttle, which in the course of a decade moved $3 billion in weapons and cash supplied by the United States and Saudi Arabia over the twisting roads that led to Afghanistan and to the fighters called Mujahideen. Brigadier Mohammed Yusuf, a career army officer, controlled the flow, not from an army post, but from Pakistan's most powerful spy agency, the ISI.
One of the reasons is that we did not want to have an open confrontation with the Soviet Union. So it was a political decision that we must not accept that the military aid is being provided to the Afghan Mujahideen through Pakistan. Then the ISI played its own part and ensured that their whole program remained secret.
It was a very natural ally, the Pakistanis, the ISI, and it was a matter of saying, well, if you people will help us, we'll turn this over to you, we'll do it by surrogate.
In doing this, America lost control of the war, says Jack Bloom, a former congressional investigator who has delved deeply into the intrigues of the Afghan conflict.
We became deeply enmeshed with the Pakistani army, and then we allowed the Pakistanis to have the dominant role in determining who the players would be who took charge of this war on the Mujahideen side.
Peshawar, located close to Pakistan's northwest border with Afghanistan, it became a hotbed of intrigue. A fantasy land for drug smugglers, arms dealers, and soldiers of fortune, all out to make a buck in the Afghan war. But it was also a magnet for Muslim militants from around the world, fanatics lured here by the promise of death and salvation in a holy war.
It was a recruiting ground for all kinds of lunatics, you know.
Salman Taseer is a senior official in the Pakistan People's Party, which forms the country's government today.
They never exercised any control on them at that time. As long as they were carrying out, the instructions of or carrying out American interests, the Americans were quite happy with what went on.
Today, it's a subject of embarrassed speculation, how much the Americans really knew about their partners, and especially this man, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a major beneficiary of money, arms, and recruits directed to him and his fighters by the Pakistanis.
Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was the darling of the Americans and of the ISI. They supported him, they projected him, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's word was magic to them. They swore by him.
Hekmatyar was notorious in much of Afghanistan for ruthlessly eliminating anyone who opposed him. He would eventually become the inspiration for a generation of Muslim extremists, many of whom would go on to create havoc in other countries, including the United States. Moderate Afghanis warned Americans about Hekmatyar, to little avail.
These people would say to me, you're backing the wrong horse. This guy wants total power. This guy is stealing and reselling many of the weapons. These weapons are winding up in the wrong hands in the wrong place. And you will regret the fact that you're allowing this Islamic fundamentalist to be our chief leader. And I think in retrospect, they were absolutely right.
In Langley, Virginia, where the CIA was trying to manage a war by remote control, warnings about fanatics were way down their list of concerns. On instructions from Washington. Robert Gates was the #2 man at the CIA from 1986 until 1989.
We learned as time went along that some were fairly extreme in their views, quite anti-American as a matter of fact. But Islamic fundamentalism in terms of was really not an issue as long as the target was the Soviet Union.
There are people who worked for your agency who claim that Afghanistan was a major triumph for the CIA. How do you rate it?
There's no question in my mind that it was an important success for this country and also for CIA. After all, the Russians left.
The Russians left, but 4 years later, Afghans are further away than ever from the peace they hoped would follow. Their capital city, Kabul, has been in many places reduced to rubble. It's an armed camp, split among 4 rival factions, a battleground with no armistice in sight. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is now Prime Minister of the country. He shows remarkably little gratitude for the American money and weapons that helped to put him where he is.
I should say that there was no direct contact with them. And I say it categorically that we have received nothing from them.
Nothing directly from the Americans?
Nothing.
You couldn't have won that struggle without the armaments. And the
may I tell you that all these armaments were with Americans, but they were defeated in Vietnam.
What made the difference in Afghanistan?
Our determination, readiness for sacrifices, our faith in Allah.
For Afghanistan, the war was a return to the Dark Ages. Today, the closest they get to peace is an occasional interlude in fighting between people who want a modern democracy here and those like Hekmatyar who want an Islamic state, like Sudan, even if it has to be imposed at gunpoint. Dr. Abdullah, a self-described moderate and official spokesman for the Afghan Defense Ministry, finds it ironic that the West now fears Hekmatyar.
Those huge amount of aid which went to Hekmatyar made Hekmatyar. We were arguing this right from the beginning. He is not the sort of the man which will be useful for Afghanistan or for the rest of the world.
An hour's drive from the capital of the country of which he is Prime Minister, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar directs his holy struggle from a bunker, guarded by a powerful militia. Hard men, toughened by years of combat against the Soviets, now in a civil war. Convinced the victory they deserve is denied because America now says they're terrorists and won't help them anymore.
That time they were calling Mujahideen as heroes of fighting for freedom. But today they waged false propaganda against Mujahideen. They consider Mujahideen's government as a threat.
Today, Hekmatyar and US, both, they hate each other. I think they are #1 enemies of each other.
Brigadier Mohammed Yusuf, former Pakistani middleman between the CIA and the Afghan fighters, has no doubt who's to blame for the breakdown: the Americans.
Once they saw that they have achieved their national, regional objectives, then they took deliberate steps that the Islamic fundamentalist government is not established in Afghanistan. Probably they would have preferred a red Afghanistan than a green Afghanistan.
In Washington today, analysts claim Hekmatyar's green Islamic Afghanistan presents a new terrorist threat. But if that is so, it's a threat Washington inadvertently may have cultivated.
What we do is we pour weapons into the region. We make book with people who are Islamic fundamentalists with agendas of their own, who have terrorism very much on their agenda and very much in their minds, who are prepared to train freebooting terrorists from all over the Islamic world to help them in their effort. And once you train people in these techniques for some kind of insurgency, you can't untrain them. And you then have what we in the United States refer to as a disposal problem.
Salman Taseer feels the Americans never understood the Afghan conflict sufficiently to anticipate the problems that would arise when it ended.
When the Afghan war finished, a lot of these people obviously were unemployed. And they began to look for other anchors. And the other Muslim Brotherhood and fundamentalist organizations internationally found fertile recruiting ground here. And these people had been trained during the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And they were looking for causes.
New York City, February 26th last year. A 500-kilogram bomb explodes under the World Trade Center. 6 people are killed. It would not be the last terrorist scare in New York. Just 5 months after this, law enforcement agents would uncover a spectacular plot to bomb other high-profile targets in the city. It didn't take investigators long to assemble a cast of suspects believed to be involved directly and indirectly in the bombing and the bomb plots in New York. The more difficult question was why they did it. As the weeks and the months went by, the evidence seemed to point to a surprising and alarming answer. The people the Americans thought were their allies in a holy war against the Soviet Union now seemed to be gearing up for another holy war against them. The World Trade Center bombing. 3 suspects fought in Afghanistan. 1 was indirectly involved. Among those arrested for the later bombing plot, a sheikh who was deeply involved in the Afghan war, and several militant Muslims from Sudan.
I saw his charge on the screen of TV. I couldn't believe it. I mean, there are a few Sudanese who have been detained now and isolated in their cells, but there is hardly any evidence at all leveled against them. And so these are indications that there is an anti-Islamic spirit now which is prevailing in the leadership of America, and this is unfortunate.
How do you react to the connections that are being drawn between terrorism in the United States, most recently the World Trade Center bombing, and Afghanistan?
We are against terrorism. We will never support terrorism anywhere in the world. And I don't think that it is in favor of America to adopt such policy toward Afghanistan.
You say it's a dangerous approach?
It is not a good approach, I should say.
When we come back, the price America paid for an alliance with Pakistan.
We at CIA were given to believe that intelligence that would deter continued Pakistani alliance with us in this effort would be unwelcome.
St. Catharines, Ontario. Heavily armed policemen surround the city's courthouse. They occupy strategic rooftops, scanning the neighborhood for hostile movement. Then a procession of police cars and a paddy wagon all vanish quickly through a back entrance. The surveillance outside continues until the vehicles are safely inside. The extraordinary precautions were considered necessary because of a trial that was underway here late last year. 5 men accused of plotting to terrorize the Hindu community in Toronto. The trial was here because security is easier in a smaller city. The 5 accused men are suspected terrorists. They are members of a shadowy organization called Jamaat ul-Fuqra. Fuqra has been linked with 16 firebombings and assassinations during the past 10 years through the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. Formed 14 years ago by a Muslim extremist from Pakistan to support the holy war in Afghanistan, Fuqra has carried its jihad far afield against Jews, Hindus, and even non-conformist Muslims. Much of what is known about Fuqra comes from material seized in a police raid on a storage locker in Colorado Springs 5 years ago. They found explosives, grenades, military training manuals, handguns, pipe bombs, an assortment of paraphernalia for making more bombs. One of the American investigators, Sergeant William Lidd, took al-Fuqra very seriously.
There's no question in my mind that they're a very, very highly developed, very sophisticated organization. They're very secretive, they're highly disciplined. They really meet a lot of the characteristics that we would place on a traditional organized terrorist group.
Al-Fuqra probably started here in the slums of Lahore, Pakistan. These dusty, noisy neighborhoods bustled with intrigue during the 10-year war in Afghanistan. And they were a reliable source of young recruits who trained at nearby paramilitary camps prior to setting off for the Afghan Jihad. But the movement didn't stop here, according to North American police investigators. In the early 1980s, it went to the United States and Canada, carried there by a mysterious Muslim sheikh, a mystic with a violent streak named Mubarak Ali Shah Gilani, supposed founder of a chain of religious universities.
There are people all over Pakistan and North America and who knows where else, Sudan, Afghanistan today, who say they are members of Jamaat ul-Fuqra, and you are their leader.
You will not find a single person in Pakistan, single person in Sudan, and single person in America who can say there is something like Jamaat ul-Fuqra.
We've talked to Sheikh Gilani, and he says there's no such a group as al-Fuqra, that Fuqra is just a word meaning poverty. What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say he needs to become more adept at lying. It's an interesting spin on what we know to be the truth. I have in my possession a couple of magazines that produced by the group, by the organization Jamaat al-Fuqra, in which Sheikh Gilani writes the editorial page. He's listed on the masthead as being the founder and president of the organization. There's a very obvious connection between Sheikh Gilani and the active group called Jamaat al-Fuqra.
It looks like that, it should, but as I say, I never found it an organization like that.
5 members of al-Fuqra went on trial in St. Catharines for plotting to blow up a Hindu theater and a Hindu temple in Toronto. What are we to make of that?
This is all lies, all lies. I know what happened. I mean, they just have some notebooks and sketches on that.
Yes.
They are going to do this and that. None. They would have never done it. Never.
Had you ever heard of any of these people before? Were these people part of your jihad in Afghanistan?
No, they were not. But I do know that 1 or 2 of them did come to Pakistan and they attended Islamic University there, and they went back to propagate Islam.
This is Sheikh Gilani in a less mystical pose, talking about how he helped Muslims in Kashmir prepare to defend themselves.
And give them highly, specialized training and guerrilla warfare.
He calls this organization Soldiers of Allah, specifically training Muslim guerrillas to fight in the Indian region of Kashmir, with, he says, some dramatic results.
Once they join our university, they become real good citizens. They stop smoking, they stop stealing, they stop living on welfare, they start doing jobs, and they become real good citizens. This is what I teach them.
Sheikh Gilani and his various organizations are today considered by U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies to be part of an international terrorist threat, much of which they say originates in the extremist fringes of Islamic fundamentalism. But Gilani and his followers are not so much creatures of Islam as they are remnants of a very secular alliance between the United States and Pakistan for the Afghan war, an alliance which may have compromised some of America's highest principles. The man with Ronald Reagan is General Zia-ul-Haq, military ruler of Pakistan during most of the 80s. General Zia and President Reagan both saw Afghanistan as a place to strike a damaging blow against a common enemy, the Soviet Union. But Zia also had a hidden agenda. Salman Taseer, today a prominent member of Pakistan's ruling party, saw grave perils for his country in Zia's handling of the Afghan jihad.
It became a jihad which was going to carry on. That when the Soviet Empire collapsed, they were going to carry this jihad into Central Asia, into Kashmir, into surrounding countries. And the Afghan war was a godsend for General Zia-ul-Haq. He was suddenly fighting a holy war. And for him then, he got massive amounts of international aid, American money poured in. They got his intelligence agencies were heavily financed, supported and trained by the Americans. And the ISI really took birth during that time.
Brigadier Imtiaz Ahmed, head of the ISI Internal Bureau, used Zia's fundamentalist agenda to pursue his own projects, and al-Fuqra was one of them, according to intelligence sources.
he was a kind of Ollie North character, you know, who had this kind of reactionary, fundamentalistic attitude. He thought himself a great patriot as well. And he was a kind of loose cannon who could justify anything he did because they felt that God was on their side.
The call to jihad for Pakistan offered General Zia more than a chance to check the Soviets. It seemed that Providence was offering an opportunity once and for all to trump the enemy to his east, India. The jihad would provide a cover for a series of intrigues that would be justified by the triumph of Islam in South Asia, and a victory for the anti-communist crusaders who guided American policy through the Reagan years.
Pakistan and its continued cooperation was seen as strategically pivotal.
According to Jack Bloom, strategic considerations were sufficient to offset any misgivings the Reagan government might have had about General Zia's schemes.
The problem becomes once you make an alliance with somebody and he becomes your proxy and you get into a variety of dealings with him, two things happen. One, you've asked him to do things, he's done things for you, you owe him. You now have an obligation to protect the person involved. Now, that gets to be very awkward, especially if the guy turns up later doing terribly evil things.
By the mid-1980s, the CIA had intelligence that would normally have set off loud alarms, but which now seemed to be off-limits. Pakistan's nuclear program, which America's spies were indicating now included a bomb. CIA analysts got a clear impression there was a higher priority than nuclear proliferation.
Expelling the Soviets from Afghanistan was a major U.S. policy interest, and we at CIA were given to believe that intelligence that would deter continued Pakistani alliance with us in this effort would be unwelcome.
John Gentry, a CIA analyst then, was surprised at first, then shocked by what he saw as a clear act of suppression.
At the directive, many in CIA believe, of Robert Gates, there was an effort made to suppress the publication of the information that we were collecting on the Pakistani nuclear program in one of the major CIA intelligence publications. If data showing Pakistani development of nuclear weapons was made available to the Congress, that there would have been a mandatory legal cutoff of U.S. assistance to Pakistan as part of U.S. law.
Robert Gates was deputy director of the CIA at the time.
There was no suppression of information on the Pakistani nuclear program, except to the extent that it was not widely disseminated throughout the government solely because of the sensitivity of the information. But those who had a need to know and who had operational responsibilities for both proliferation in Pakistan were informed, both in the executive branch and in the Congress.
For John Gentry, there has never been any doubt that his bosses looked the other way as Pakistan tried to build a bomb.
I can't talk about the specifics of judgments in this area for secrecy reasons, but it is clear in the case of information about the Pakistani nuclear program that data were suppressed for the purposes of avoiding an intelligence-generated embarrassment.
Not far from Lahore, across the border in India, there was another potential embarrassment. Sikhs based in Amritsar, near their holiest shrine, the Golden Temple, were struggling for independence, and there is compelling evidence that they had covert backing from Pakistan and America's partner in the Afghan Holy War, the ISI.
I think that ISI and Pakistani intelligence people had their own agendas, and they saw this as a wonderful opportunity to go after the Indians, to engage in a kind of worldwide enterprise of their own for their own purposes.
When we return, did the Holy War obstruct a Canadian investigation into mass murder? shortly after sunrise, October 15th, 1992. Near a remote village in the Indian Punjab, people wait for an encounter which will perhaps forever seal one of Canada's most tragic mysteries. They have come prepared for battle. Each approaching vehicle is scrutinized. Suddenly, a carload of heavily armed men arrives. According to subsequent police reports, a fierce gun battle breaks out almost immediately. Among the dead, Intikhab Ahmed Zia, an alleged agent of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI, and a Canadian, Talwinder Singh Parmar, prime suspect in the bombing of an Air India flight out of Toronto 7.5 years earlier. Inspector K.P.S. Gill, Director General of Police for the Punjab, had been hunting Talwinder Singh for a long time.
He was one of our top terrorists, and it was felt that he was a very dangerous operative.
June 23rd, 1985. Air India Flight 182 leaves Toronto bound for Bombay and New Delhi with 329 passengers and crew. The next morning, off the coast of Ireland, it is blown out of the sky. There are no survivors. In the days that follow, Irish and Canadian searchers probed the cold Atlantic for bodies and bits of wreckage. The priority is to find evidence to confirm early suspicions that this crime was part of an extremist campaign for an independent Sikh homeland in the Punjab, a cause we now know had covert support from Pakistan's most powerful spy agency, the ISI.
First of all, they provided training to a large number of people who had gone across. About 500 people were trained initially. Subsequently, they were supplying arms.
Lahore, Pakistan is just across the border from the Indian Punjab. This was a convenient base for operations against India, which was, next to the Soviet Union, Pakistan's most potent security threat. Sikh militants say they found refuge here in the Iqbal town neighborhood of Lahore. This is where they came to lick the wounds they received in operations across the line in the Indian Punjab. It was here, they say, that they received encouragement and training from Pakistan's ISI for future operations. And more ominously, this is where a fateful connection happened between an alleged ISI agent named Intikhab Ahmed Zia and a Sikh militant named Talwinder Singh Parmar. Parmar was never charged with the Air India bombing. There has never been sufficient evidence to charge anybody. In 1985, he beat a botched Canadian attempt to prosecute him on explosives charges. Eventually, he dropped out of sight. But he never relented in his struggle for Sikh independence. And his ongoing connections with Pakistan, where he armed himself before his death, have never fully been explored. Another early suspect in the Air India case is this man, Lal Singh. He has been a source for much that Indian authorities now know about Pakistani involvement in Sikh extremism during the 80s. Lal Singh has been in jail in India since the summer of 1992. In this confession, he describes how he and other Sikhs, including Parmar, worked through ISI contacts to buy weapons near the Afghan border in a place called Dar Adam Khal, and how they planned terrorist attacks on India, and how they trained in the United States. Meet Frank Camper, Vietnam veteran turned mercenary trainer, at a camp near Birmingham, Alabama, where a CBC crew shot these scenes in the fall of 1985. Here, Camper demonstrates his unique interviewing technique.
I put a round through his knee, and then I say, "Where's your fucking people?" I didn't say, "If you don't tell me, I'll hurt you." I hurt him first.
In this video, Camper spoke about some of his most dedicated students.
November of 1984, we took 4 Sikh separatists through this course. Their intentions were to go back to India and act as commandos and fight the Indian Army. In truth, what they really had in mind was to go back and act and function as terrorists.
Camper has confirmed that one of the Sikh trainees was Lal Singh. But what he didn't tell his students or the CBC back then was that for the 8 months leading up to the Air India bombing, he had been a paid FBI informant. Camper lured Lal Singh and the other Sikhs into disclosures about training in Pakistan and plans for terrorism in India. But the FBI didn't seem very interested in the information.
Our own intelligence people had refused to notify the Indians of these targets. And it was very frustrating on my part.
Maybe they just didn't believe you. Maybe they thought you were just making things up.
No. The intelligence that I was gathering was corroborated by too many different other people. They knew that my intelligence was good.
Well, what did this intelligence tell you? What was the picture that was painted?
The Sikhs were deadly serious in their intentions to raise hell in India, that they had all the capabilities that they needed to do it. And the capabilities included a liaison with Pakistan, and it astounded me that we, meaning the Americans, weren't going to do more to stop them.
June 23rd, 1985. Camper hears the news about Air India.
The bottom dropped out of my stomach. I got physically ill. I knew the Sikhs had wanted to do that, and I knew that they had been successful. It would only be later that I knew more details about the construction of the bomb, how it was put on the aircraft, etc.
As the disaster investigation got underway, Camper expected to be asked to elaborate on what he'd earlier reported about Sikh terrorists. He was in for a surprise.
It was during this time that I was told by my FBI superior that should Canadian intelligence want to talk to me or attempt to contact me, that I could not discuss anything with them, that I couldn't tell them anything that they knew, that I couldn't give them the time of day.
Why would the United States make such an unusual request?
After the Air India bombing, had Pakistan been implicated as a supporter of the Sikhs, had the U.S. public known this, or had the Congress known this, very likely the relationship that we had with Pakistan, to use Pakistan as a rearming and training facility for our war in Afghanistan, Pakistan might have cut that off. They might have denied that to us. So, in essence, the U.S. support of the Afghani rebels was being imperiled.
3 years would pass before Camper would be asked officially what he knew about Sikh activities in the U.S. by a Senate committee. Working for that committee, Jack Bloom.
Do we take Frank Camper seriously?
Absolutely. We were told by government officials, particularly by the FBI, that he'd been extremely helpful. And we went back into his Pentagon records and other government records and found that the stories he told us were true.
The CIA's primary liaison with the FBI was through the Bureau's Foreign Counterintelligence Program. We have learned that in the months just before the Air India bombing, Frank Camper worked for that program. But former CIA Deputy Director Robert Gates says he knew nothing of Pakistani involvement with the Sikhs until long after the destruction of Air India Flight 182.
The information began coming to us well after the Soviets had left Afghanistan, so we're looking at the very late 1980s. In fact, when President Bush sent me to Pakistan and India in May of 1990, one of the specific requests that I made of the President of Pakistan was that they close the training camps that were providing people to carry out operations in Kashmir, as well as in Indian Punjab.
But surely the world's most resourceful intelligence agency
would have known what was happening between two of the world's most volatile adversaries?
I don't know what specifics may have been available to the agency during that time. I can only tell you what I was aware of. And the reality is that the focus was toward Afghanistan and toward getting the Soviets out.
U.S. government sources support the assertion that Washington was well aware of Pakistan's involvement with militant Sikhs during the 80s, but were reluctant to make an issue of it for fear of jeopardizing the campaign to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. Canadian intelligence sources confirmed that neither the FBI nor the CIA provided any useful assistance during the investigation of the Air India bombing, though they are careful to point out that they never suspected any formal obstruction. Today, Punjabi Police Inspector Gill says Pakistan's support was crucial to the Sikh terror campaign during the 80s.
I should say that if we take the years from in the post-84 period, if Pakistan's abetment was not there, terrorism would have been over about 7-8 years back.
Almost 8 years after the Air India bombing, the head of the CIA informs a Senate committee Pakistan is on the brink of being listed a state sponsor of terrorism for this reason.
As for Pakistan, it has supported the Kashmiri and Sikh groups, which have been waging long-running insurgencies against India's central government.
The definition of terrorism seems to be relative, says Ambassador Edward Peck, who served on a vice presidential task force on terrorism in the mid-80s.
One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist.
And what makes the difference between
a freedom fighter and a terrorist? It's the same definition for all the countries in the world. If we support them, they're freedom fighters. If somebody else supports them, they're terrorists. And in the case of Pakistan, I don't have to see any proof. It's just one of the things that a nation is going to do to defend itself, to advance its interests.
When Sikh terrorists were connected directly with the blowing up of an Air India airliner, didn't the CIA, or wouldn't it have, felt inclined to ask Pakistan if they were absolutely clean on that particular incident?
I don't know the answer to the question. I presume that question may have been asked.
How do you account for a great gap involving a major terrorist crime that might indirectly have had Pakistan's fingerprints on it?
I don't think that the United States has condoned or acquiesced in a state sponsoring terrorism anywhere in the world. Frankly, these are questions that I don't remember the answers to or didn't know the answers to. But as a matter of principle, I do not accept the notion that the United States would have shrunk from raising it with Pakistan if they thought they had a case.
How much should one expect the CIA would have known about terrorism by its ally, Pakistan, during the 80s?
A fair bit. That's what the CIA does for a living. We have been involved in or turned our blind eye on all sorts of nasty and dirty things, all over the world, if we thought it was in our best interest to do so. That is the bottom line.
The Reagan administration didn't want anything to interfere with this war at all, with the success of this war. And on the grander scale, defeating the Russians was more important than the Indian-Sikh conflict. Far more important than that. And in the overall scheme, it was more important than the people who died on Air India or the people who were killed at Narita in Japan. Sometimes governments make decisions like this that either lead to sacrifices, human sacrifices, or they cover up the death of people. And in this case, the Reagan administration did this for its political expediency in Afghanistan.
June 23, 1986. 1 year after the Air India tragedy, mourners gather near Cork, Ireland, to remember the victims. They are comforted by a solemn promise from Canada's then Minister for External Affairs, Joe Clark.
Your governments will not rest until we find the causes and bring to justice those who are responsible.
8.5 years after the bombing, the grieving goes on. The promises of justice unfulfilled. The truth obscured by politics.
The Fifth Estate will return.
That's our program for tonight. Remember, you can see it again on News World Sunday night at 9 Eastern Time. Right now on the CBC, please stay tuned for primetime news. For all of us at the Fifth Estate, good night. America must be destroyed. Sudan must be built strong. The songs and rhetoric never stray far from a dominant theme: Islam under siege.
They say that a superpower is against Islam. I say, when was in our history superpower not against Islam?